The scent of old paper and betrayal is the same in every language. I breathed it in, the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light of Silas Vane's penthouse office. My fingers, usually steady as a surgeon's, trembled as I adjusted the microphone clip to my blouse. A nervous tic I'd fought for years. One of my father's, Arthur Vance, would have gently chided me for. Precision, Ellie. In language, in life. No room for tremors. But there was no precision here. Only the vague, chilling dread that had been my constant companion since my father vanished 3 months ago. "You are comfortable, Miss Vance?" Silas Vane was a study in contained power. He didn't so much sit behind his vast obsidian desk as inhabit the space around it. He had eyes the color of a winter storm. "Perfectly, Mr. Vane," I replied, my voice thankfully even. I gestured to the documents. "The final contracts for the Marseille acquisition. I've completed the cross-analysis. The terminology is consistent. This was my world. I was a ghost in the machine of international business, the unseen conduit for billions of dollars and immense power. I found the lies hidden in linguistic nuance. And Silas Vane was my most secretive client. The pay was astronomical, the secrecy absolute. It was the kind of job that paid off a lifetime of debts, like the debt of a missing father. The door opened, and 2 men entered without knocking. Lorenzo, Silas's nephew, has his sharp, handsome face and restless energy. He shot me a look that made my skin crawl. And Bruno, the head of security, a mountain of a man with hands that could crush stone. "The others are here," Lorenzo announced. "They're impatient." "Let them wait," Silas said, his gaze still on me. "Miss Vance, we have a small informal meeting now. The participants will be speaking in a mix of Italian and Sicilian dialect. I need you to provide real-time whispered translation for me." A formality, my heart stuttered. Real-time translation was high pressure, but doable. The informal part set off alarms. Men like Silas Vane didn't have informal meetings. They had strategies and executions. "Of course," I said, my professional mask firmly in place. Bruno opened the door again. 3 more men filed in. They were different. They wore their violence like cologne. The leader, a man with a web of scars around his left eye, was introduced as Donato. His voice was like grinding gravel. The meeting began. Silas and Donato exchanged pleasantries that were as sharp as razor wire. I leaned close to Silas, my voice a soft, steady stream in his ear, translating the fluid Italian. It was about shipping lanes, tariffs, and territory. The language was corporate, but the subtext was something else entirely. Then the tone shifted. Donato's voice dropped, the Sicilian dialect becoming thicker, more colloquial, a language I'd learned from my father's old taped conversations with his relatives in Palermo. "A lifetime ago. The old problem remains, Silas," Donato grumbled. "The one who talks too much. The one who thinks the old ways are a weakness," I translated smoothly, my brain on autopilot. "He says there is a lingering issue. Someone who is a liability. Someone who doesn't respect the traditional structure." Silas steepled his fingers. "Some roots go deep, Donato, but a tree that bears no fruit, or one that threatens the entire orchard, must be cut down." Donato nodded, a cruel smile on his lips. He leaned forward. "Then we agree. The leak must be plugged, permanently. Arthur Vance has become too great a risk." The name hit me like a physical blow. Arthur Vance. The air left my lungs. The world narrowed to the sound of my own blood roaring in my ears. The translation died on my lips. I froze mid-sentence, my body turning to ice. My father. They were talking about my father. Donato continued, oblivious to the earthquake he'd triggered. "The old fool has been sniffing around where he doesn't belong, asking questions about the corporate restructuring. He thinks he can expose us. We gave him a warning. We took his little import business. We took his savings. But he doesn't listen." My eyes, wide and unblinking, flicked to Silas. His face was a mask of cold consideration. He wasn't surprised. He was assessing. "He was a good earner once," Silas said, his voice devoid of any emotion I could recognize as human. "Loyal. But sentiment is a luxury we cannot afford. If he will not be quiet, then he must be silenced. Make it clean. A car accident. He's been distraught since his business collapsed. It will be believable." The words, delivered in that calm, reasonable tone, were more horrifying than Donato's gravelly threats. This was a death sentence. For my father. Ordered by the man I was working for, my mind shattered. One part screamed a raw, silent keen of terror. The other, The professional, the survivor, fought for control. Do not react. Do not move. Breathe. I realized my pen had stopped moving. I forced my fingers to tighten around it. I pushed a slow, shallow breath into my frozen lungs. I had to keep translating. If I stopped completely, if I revealed I understood, I was dead too. I was a witness. I leaned back toward Silas, my lips barely an inch from his ear. I could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive, and beneath it, the cold scent of absolute power. My voice, when it came, was a thread of sound, miraculously steady. He confirms, the target is Arthur Vance. He agrees with the method. A car accident, he says. Sentiment is a luxury. I delivered the death sentence for my own father into the ear of the man who had just authorized it, and as I did, I made a silent vow, forged in the white-hot fire of my terror and grief. I would not let them win. The world had not ended. The sun still slanted through the windows. Dust motes still danced. My heart, however, had been replaced by a block of ice, beating a dull, painful rhythm against my ribs. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. I translated it all, my voice a ghost, a monotone stream of betrayal. I was an automaton. Silas showed no reaction to my translation of his own death order. He merely nodded, his stormy eyes fixed on Donato. When Donato and his men finally stood to leave, the air shifted. Lorenzo followed them out, already on his phone. Bruno remained. Silas turned to me. Your work was impeccable, Miss Vance, as always. He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. Your payment. In cash, as you requested. My fingers, numb and cold, reached for the envelope. It was thick, heavy with bills that now felt tainted. This money was my father's blood price. I tucked it into my portfolio, my movements slow, deliberate. Thank you, Mr. Vane, I heard myself say. The words tasted like ash. Bruno will see you out, Silas said, already turning away. I had been dismissed. Bruno gestured toward the door. I stood, my legs feeling like straw. I willed them to hold my weight, to walk normally. One wrong step, one flicker of panic, and the mountain would crush me. I felt his gaze on my back, a physical pressure as I walked out. The elevator ride down was a descent into hell. I stood beside Bruno, staring at my own pale, terrified reflection in the steel doors. I didn't breathe until they slid open onto the lobby. Have a good evening, Miss Vance, Bruno rumbled. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and walked away, my heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the marble. I didn't look back. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced a steady pace until I pushed through the glass doors into the evening air. The city was alive around me, a world blissfully unaware of the abyss beneath my feet. I walked for 2 blocks, then 3, my breath sharp and ragged. I ducked into a narrow alley, pressing my back against the cool brick, finally allowing the tremor to take over. I slid down the wall, my head in my hands, the sobs I'd been holding back finally breaking free. They had my father, and they were going to kill him. I don't know how long I sat there in that grimy alley, the rough brick scraping against my back, but the sobs eventually subsided into shaky, hiccuping breaths. The initial paralyzing shock was receding, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I had to move. Sitting here made me a target. I was a loose end, and in Silas Vane's world, loose ends were snipped without a second thought. I pushed myself up, my legs still unsteady. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, smearing mascara and alley filth. I probably looked like a mess, a woman who'd had too much to drink or a nasty fight with a lover. Good. Let them think that. Let me be invisible. My apartment was out of the question. It was the first place they would look if they became suspicious. My father's empty house was even worse. I had no family left, no close friends I could drag into this nightmare. My work had made me a solitary creature, a ghost. Now that isolation was a prison. I needed a place to think, to plan. Somewhere public, anonymous, with no cameras pointed at the patrons. I thought of the old public library downtown, the one with the cavernous reading rooms and carols tucked away in forgotten corners. It was a start. I walked, keeping my head down, my leather portfolio clutched to my chest like a shield. Every passing glance from a stranger felt like an accusation. Every black sedan that slowed near a curb sent a fresh jolt of terror through me. I was hyper-aware of everything, My senses stretched to a breaking point. The world had become a hostile landscape, every shadow a potential threat. The library was a sanctuary of quiet and dusty calm. The air smelled of old books and floor wax, a familiar, comforting scent that did little to soothe the frantic beating of my heart. I found an empty carrel in the history section, far from the main thoroughfare, and sank into the wooden chair. I pulled out my laptop, my fingers fumbling as I connected to the public Wi-Fi through a VPN I prayed was secure enough. My first search was for my father's name, Arthur Vance. The results were the same as they had been for the last 3 months. A few old articles about his import business, his charity work, nothing about his disappearance. The police had filed a missing persons report, but with no evidence of foul play, and his company having recently collapsed, the prevailing theory was that he'd skipped town to escape his debts. I had never believed it. My father was a fighter. He wouldn't run. He would dig in and try to fix things. Now I knew the truth. He hadn't run. He'd been silenced. Or, more accurately, he was in the process of being permanently silenced. I opened a new private browser window. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to press them flat against the cool wood of the desk to steady them. I needed to understand what I was up against. I typed Silas Vane into the search bar. The results were sanitized, corporate profiles, philanthropy announcements, a few grainy paparazzi shots of him at charity galas. There was no mention of the Vane Corporation being a front for a criminal organization. Nothing about Donato. Nothing about murder. He was a ghost, a well-dressed phantom who operated from the shadows. But I had been in those shadows today. I had heard the monster's heartbeat. Frustration bubbled up inside me, hot and acidic. I was a linguist, a translator, not an investigator. What did I think I was going to find? A convenient blog post titled, "How to Stop a Mafia Hit on Your Father." Think, Alara. Think like a translator. You don't just translate words. You translate context, subtext, and meaning. What was the context here? My father had been sniffing around. He'd been asking questions about a corporate restructuring. He thought he could expose them. What did he know? And where would he have hidden it? My father was old school. He distrusted the cloud, called it a fancy filing cabinet in the sky. He kept physical records. Meticulous, obsessive records. He had a home office filled with filing cabinets, ledgers, and boxes of documents dating back decades. The police had given it a cursory look, but they hadn't found anything. They weren't looking for a needle in a haystack. They weren't even sure there was a haystack. But I was. A spark of hope, terrifying in its fragility, flickered to life in my chest. There had to be something there. A clue, a record. Something that proved what Silas Vane and Donato were doing. Something that could be used as leverage. But going to his house was a massive risk. It was undoubtedly being watched. Bruno's men or Donato's would be keeping an eye on it, waiting to see if my father resurfaced, or if anyone else came poking around. I needed a way in that they wouldn't expect. A way to be a ghost. I closed my laptop, my mind racing. The plan that was forming was insane, riddled with 1,000 ways it could go horribly wrong, but it was the only plan I had. I stood up, my resolve hardening. The terror was still there, a constant, cold companion, but it was now joined by something else. A fierce, desperate determination. They thought my father was a loose end. They thought I was a harmless tool. They had no idea what a woman who had nothing left to lose was capable of. I left the library, merging back into the flow of pedestrians on the street. My destination was a 24-hour big-box store on the outskirts of the city. I moved with purpose now, the aimless panic replaced by a focused mission. Inside the brightly lit, cavernous store, I felt another wave of surreal disconnect. Here, people were worried about the price of cereal and the quality of paper towels, utterly unaware that I was shopping for supplies to wage a private war against a murderous criminal empire. I found what I needed in the automotive section. A set of basic mechanics coveralls, a dark beanie, and a pair of work gloves. In the hardware aisle, I picked up a heavy-duty flashlight and a small, compact crowbar. The items felt alien and heavy in my hands. I was preparing for a break-in into my own father's house. At the checkout, the cashier barely glanced at me as she scanned the crowbar. "Working on a project?" she asked, her voice bored. "Something like that," I murmured, my throat tight. Back on the street, I found what I was looking for, a beat-up. 10-year-old sedan parked in a dimly lit lot, its windshield sporting a fresh parking ticket. It was the kind of car nobody looked at twice. Using the crowbar, I jimmied the lock open with a shocking ease that sent another chill down my spine. I slid inside, the smell of stale coffee and cigarettes filling my nostrils. Hot wiring it was a skill I'd learned from a rebellious college boyfriend, a pointless bit of trivia that had now become the most valuable knowledge I possessed. The engine sputtered to life. I was now a criminal, a car thief. The descent was happening faster than I could process. I drove toward my father's neighborhood, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The lovely, quiet, tree-lined streets of my childhood now felt like a gauntlet. I parked the stolen car 2 blocks over from his house, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pulled on the coveralls over my clothes, tucking my hair up into the beanie. In the rearview mirror, I didn't see Alara Vance, the respected translator. I saw a stranger, a desperate woman on the edge. It was time to go home. The streets of my old neighborhood were too quiet, the silence itself a threat. Every shadow between the sprawling oak trees felt like it was watching me. I cut the engine of the stolen sedan and let the silence press in, listening for any sound that didn't belong. A footstep, a car door, the low murmur of a radio. Nothing. Just the distant hum of the city and the frantic thumping of my own heart. I slipped out of the car. The bulky coveralls scratchy against my skin. The beanie felt tight, constricting. I was a ghost in my own life, an intruder in the place that held my happiest memories. The walk to my father's house was the longest 2 blocks of my life. Every nerve ending was on fire, screaming at me to run. But I kept putting one foot in front of the other, my gaze fixed on the familiar silhouette of the 2-story colonial at the end of the street. His house. The place he'd poured his heart into after my mother died. The garden she'd planted was now overgrown, the paint on the shutters beginning to peel. It looked exactly like what it was, a house whose heart had been ripped out. And I was about to break into it. I didn't approach from the front. That was for guests, for family. I was neither now. I slipped down the narrow, overgrown path along the side of the house, the branches of an untamed rosebush snagging on the coveralls. The moon was a sliver behind a veil of cloud, offering little light. I was grateful for the darkness. The back door led into the kitchen. I knew the lock was flimsy. My father was always meaning to replace it. I pulled the small crowbar from the deep pocket of the coveralls. The cold, solid weight of it was both a comfort and a condemnation. I was really doing this. The sound of the wood splintering around the lock was deafening in the stillness. I froze, pressing myself against the siding, listening. No lights came on in the neighboring houses. No dogs barked. I held my breath for a count of 10, then 20. Nothing. I pushed the door open and slipped inside, closing it quietly behind me. The smell hit me first. The familiar scent of lemon polish and my father's pipe tobacco, now stale and layered with the faint sweet odor of neglect. It was a smell that used to mean home, safety. Now it smelled like a tomb. I stood in the dark kitchen, my eyes adjusting. The shapes of the table, the chairs, and the refrigerator were all exactly as he'd left them. A single coffee mug sat in the sink, a ghost of his last morning here. My throat tightened. I couldn't afford to fall apart. Not here. Not now. I clicked on the heavy-duty flashlight, its beam cutting a sharp path through the darkness. I moved through the downstairs living room, the light sweeping over the furniture, which was covered in white dust sheets. They looked like shrouds. I avoided looking at the mantelpiece, knowing the photos of my mother and me as a child were there, watching this violation. His office was at the back of the house. That was the target. The room where he'd built his business, and where I prayed. He'd hidden the evidence that would destroy his killers. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open, the beam of my flashlight illuminating the chaos. This was not the neat, orderly space I remembered. Drawers were pulled out, their contents spilled onto the floor. Files and papers were strewn everywhere. Books had been pulled from the shelves, their pages ruffled. My blood ran cold. I wasn't the first one here. They had already searched the place. Of course they had. Silas or Donato, or both, would have torn this house apart looking for whatever my father had on them. The spark of hope I'd been clinging to sputtered and nearly died. What were my chances of finding something they had missed? Despair threatened to swallow me whole. I leaned against the door frame, the fight draining out of me. It was over. I was too late. They had won. But then, the translator in me, the one who looked for patterns in chaos, kicked in. I forced myself to look again, more carefully. Yes, the room was a mess, but it was a violent, frustrated mess. This wasn't a careful, methodical search by professionals. This was the work of thugs. Men who used force instead of finesse. They had ripped and torn, but had they truly searched? My father was clever. He was a man of words and secrets, of codes and double meanings. He wouldn't hide something in a prominent place. He would hide it in plain sight. He would use a language only I would understand. I started in the one place I knew they wouldn't have appreciated. His books. Not the business ledgers, but his personal library. The collection of poetry he loved, the dense historical novels, the travel guides from the trips he and my mother had taken. I ran my gloved fingers over the spines, my flashlight beam dancing across the titles. And then I saw it. Tucked between a collection of Robert Frost's poems and a thick biography of Churchill, was a slim, unassuming volume I'd never seen before. Its spine was blank. I pulled it out. It was a blank journal, the kind you buy in a museum gift shop. But it wasn't blank inside. I opened it. The pages were filled with my father's precise, elegant handwriting. But it wasn't in English. It was in a fluid, practiced Sicilian dialect. The same dialect Donato had used. My hands trembled as I held the book. This was it. This was what they were looking for. I flipped through the pages. It was a ledger, but not of money. It was a ledger of lies, of secrets, of crimes. I saw names I recognized from the business world, as well as names I didn't. I saw dates, locations, and amounts of money transferred. And I saw Silas Vane's name, over and over again, connected to shell corporations, shipping manifests, and words like tariff avoidance and asset reallocation that I knew were euphemisms for something much darker. It was all here. The proof. He had kept a record of everything. He had known the risk he was taking, and he had documented it all in a language he knew his business partners would never bother to learn. Hidden among books they would see as worthless sentiment. A single pressed edelweiss fell from between the pages, a fragile, papery ghost from his and my mother's honeymoon in the Alps. He had hidden his greatest secret inside a memory of his greatest love. Tears blurred my vision, but I wiped them away angrily. There was no time for tears. I had what I needed. Now, I just had to get out of here alive. I tucked the journal into the inside pocket of the coveralls, buttoning it securely. It felt like carrying a live bomb. I took one last look around the ransacked office, at the ghost of my father's life, and then I turned off the flashlight. The darkness felt even heavier now, more menacing. I retraced my steps through the silent house, my senses screaming. I was almost at the back door when I heard it. The soft crunch of gravel under a footstep outside. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. My blood turned to ice. I wasn't alone. I stopped breathing. The sound was unmistakable, a deliberate, careful step on the gravel path just outside the kitchen door. They were here. Bruno's men, Donato's thugs. It didn't matter. They had found me. My mind raced, a frantic, terrified scramble. Had they been watching the house the whole time? Had they seen me go in? Or was this just a routine check, a lucky, or more accurately, an unbelievably unlucky, coincidence? I pressed my back against the wall next to the door, the rough texture of the wallpaper scraping through the thin coveralls. The journal in my inside pocket felt like a brick of solid ice against my ribs. I had the evidence, the one thing that could save my father and destroy them, and I was about to be caught with it. Another footstep, closer this time. Then a low, muffled voice. "See anything?" A second voice, deeper, replied. "Nothing. The place is a tomb. Let's do a quick sweep and get out of here. I hate this part. My blood ran cold. They were coming inside. I was trapped. The kitchen offered no cover. The living room was a sea of dust sheets. My father's office was a dead end. The only way out was the way I came in, and that was now blocked. Think, Alara. Think. The basement. The thought surfaced from a deep childhood memory. The basement door was tucked under the stairs, often overlooked. It was old, the wood swollen. It creaked like a dying man if you opened it wrong, but it was my only chance. I moved, without hesitation. I ducked low, scurrying from the kitchen into the dark hall. My heart was a wild drum in my chest, so loud I was sure they could hear it. I could see the faint outline of the basement door. I reached for the knob, my gloved hand turning it with agonizing slowness. I heard the splintered back door being pushed open behind me. A beam of a powerful flashlight swept across the kitchen floor. "Door's been jimmied," the deep voice grunted. "Someone's inside." I didn't wait. I pulled the basement door open, wincing as it let out a low, groaning creak. I slipped through the narrow opening and pulled it shut behind me, plunging myself into absolute, suffocating blackness. I stood on the top step, frozen, listening. "Did you hear that?" one of them said from the kitchen. "Sounded like the house settling. This old place is full of noise. Check it out." I didn't wait to hear more. I began descending the wooden stairs, each step a potential betrayal. I knew these stairs. The fifth one from the top squeaked. I avoided it, stepping over it with the care of a bomb disposal expert. The air grew colder, damper, with a scent of earth, concrete, and forgotten things. At the bottom, I pressed myself against the cold foundation wall, my chest heaving. I could hear them moving around upstairs, their heavy footsteps a stark contrast to my own terrified, creeping footsteps. A beam of light sliced under the basement door, dancing across the floor. "The door's down here," one of them called out. I held my breath. The doorknob rattled. Stuck. Or locked. Just the wood swollen. Give it a shove. This was it. They were coming down. I was a rat in a trap. My eyes, adjusting to the gloom, darted around the basement. It was a jumble of my childhood, an old exercise bike, boxes of Christmas decorations, my mother's abandoned pottery wheel. And there, in the far corner, barely visible, was the small, square outline of the old coal chute, boarded up decades ago, but never properly sealed. It was a memory from a game of hide-and-seek. I'd hidden there once, and my father had pretended for hours that he couldn't find me. I scrambled toward it, my hand scrabbling over the rough wood covering the opening. It was nailed shut, but the wood was soft with age. I jammed the crowbar into a seam and pried it open. A nail shrieked in protest, but the sound was masked by the thudding from the basement door as one of the men threw his shoulder against it. With a final, desperate heave, a section of the wood splintered away, revealing a square of slightly less profound darkness. It was a tight fit, barely wider than my shoulders. I shoved the crowbar through first, then squeezed in after it, head first, into the narrow, filthy brick tunnel. I was halfway through when the basement door finally burst open with a crash. Light flooded the space I had just vacated. See? Nothing. Just a bunch of junk. I froze, my body wedged in the chute, my legs still dangling in the basement. If they shone the light in this direction. Let's check the upstairs and get out. The boss said it was probably a false alarm. Some kids, maybe. Their footsteps receded as they moved back up the stairs. I didn't wait. I wriggled the rest of the way through the chute, tumbling out the other side into the damp, cold air of the narrow side yard. I landed hard on a patch of overgrown ivy, the breath knocked out of me. For a moment, I just lay there, gasping, staring up at the sliver of moon. I was out. I was alive. And I had the journal. Scrambling to my feet, I didn't bother to brush the dirt and leaves from the coveralls. I ran, not caring about noise now. My only thought to put as much distance as possible between me and that house. I reached the stolen car, fumbled with the door, and scrambled inside, locking the doors behind me as if that flimsy metal could protect me. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, my forehead resting on the steering wheel. The adrenaline was fading, leaving me shaking and hollowed out. I had survived, but I had the distinct, chilling feeling that the easy part was over. Now, I had to figure out what to do with the bomb in my pocket. I couldn't go to the police. Silas Vane's reach was too long. I was alone, with a target on my back, and a secret that could get me killed. I started the car and pulled away from the curb, driving aimlessly. I had the proof, but I had no plan. And somewhere out there, a clock was ticking down the final hours of my father's life. The city lights blurred past the windshield, a smear of neon and halogen that offered no answers. I drove without direction, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, the stolen car feeling less like a vehicle and more like a metal coffin on wheels. The journal in my pocket was a lead weight, a physical manifestation of the danger I was now in. I had the proof, but it was useless unless I knew what to do with it. I couldn't go to the police. Silas Vane's influence was like a poison in the city's veins. A man like that didn't operate without friends in high places. I'd be dead or discredited before I finished my first sentence. I needed leverage. I needed a way to force his hand, to stop the hit on my father before it was carried out. My mind, trained to find patterns, to decode meaning, kept circling back to one thing: the meeting. The cold, transactional way Silas had given the order. He wasn't a monster driven by passion. He was a CEO eliminating a business liability. In business, you can always renegotiate a deal if the variables change. The variables. The thought was so audacious, so terrifying, that I almost swerved off the road. I pulled over into the deserted parking lot of a closed-down grocery store, the engine idling roughly. What if I could change the variables? What if I could make my father more valuable to Silas alive than dead? But how? I was a translator, not a negotiator. I dealt in words, not threats. The journal. It had to hold the key. I couldn't read it while driving, as I wasn't in the right state of mind. I needed a safe place, a hole to crawl into where I could think, a motel, somewhere cheap, anonymous, and cash only, the kind of place that asked no questions and remembered no faces. I found one 20 minutes later on a shabby commercial strip, its flickering vacancy sign a beacon of desperate refuge. The Starlight Motel had seen better decades. I parked around back, away from the streetlights, and pulled the beanie low over my eyes. The man at the front desk didn't look up from his small, grainy television as I slid a $50 bill under the plexiglass partition. One night. Cash. Don't need a receipt. He grunted, pocketed the bill, and slid a key attached to a heavy, green plastic diamond back under the glass. Room 14, around back. No parties, as if my only party guest was abject terror. Room 14 smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. I locked the door behind me, sliding the flimsy chain into place. It was a pathetic defense, but it was all I had to offer. I didn't turn on the leading light. I just left the dim lamp on the nightstand, its weak yellow glow barely pushing back the shadows. I sank onto the edge of the lumpy bed, my body aching with a fatigue that went bone deep. With trembling hands, I unbuttoned the coveralls and pulled out the journal. It felt alive in my hands, humming with my father's secrets and his doomed defiance. I opened it. The Sicilian dialect flowed across the page in his elegant script. It was more than a ledger. It was a narrative. He hadn't just recorded transactions. He had recorded conversations, suspicions, timelines. He had connected dots I couldn't even see. I read for over an hour, my horror growing with every page. The Vane Corporation wasn't just a front for criminal activity. It was the criminal activity, perfectly integrated. The legitimate shipping business was a conduit for moving everything from stolen art to untraceable arms. The corporate restructuring my father had been asking about was a massive money laundering operation, siphoning millions through a complex web of European shell companies. And then I found it. The leverage. Tucked into the back of the journal was a single, typewritten sheet listing account numbers and routing codes. But it was the note scrawled in my father's hand in the margin that stopped my heart. SV Emergency Fund. Off ledger. Not even Donato knows. The key is the girl. The only thing he cares about more than money. The girl. My mind flashed back to Silas's office. The pristine, cold perfection of it. There had been no personal photos, no mementos, except on the credenza behind his desk, partially obscured by a vase, there had been a small, silver-framed picture. I'd barely registered it at the time, my focus on survival. But now, the memory surfaced with crystal clarity. It was a photograph of a young woman with dark hair and a bright, smiling face. She looked to be in her early 20s, his daughter. It had to be. Silas Vane had a vulnerability, a secret he kept even from his own ruthless organization. A daughter he protected, hidden away from the filth of his business. A plan, wild and dangerous and born of sheer desperation, began to form in my mind. It was a gamble of monstrous proportions. I couldn't just threaten him with exposure. He could have had me killed before the news even hit the presses. But if I threatened her, if I could reveal his most closely guarded secret, that I could reach her, that would change the calculation. It would make my father's continued breathing a necessary condition for his daughter's safety. But I needed proof. I needed to find her. I needed to be able to say her name, to show him I knew where she was, that my reach could extend as far as his. I looked at the list of account numbers. The emergency fund. It was a ghost account, a pile of money even his own men didn't know existed. The ultimate escape hatch. I had the journal. I had the account numbers. And now, I had the beginning of a target. I stood up, my body protesting. I was exhausted, terrified, and morally adrift. I was planning to threaten an innocent woman to save my father. I was becoming the very thing I was fighting against. But what was the alternative? Let them kill him? I walked to the motel room's grimy window and pulled the curtain back a fraction. The parking lot was currently empty. I had to move. The hit on my father was imminent. I had at most a day or a few hours at most. I needed to get online. I needed to find the girl. My laptop was in my bag, back in the trunk of the stolen car. The thought of going back out into the darkness made my skin crawl. But I had no choice. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the beanie back on and slipped out of the room. The night air was cold, biting through the coveralls. I moved quickly to the car, my senses on high alert, every shadow a potential enemy. I was a ghost hunting another ghost, and the dawn was coming. The trunk of the stolen car opened with a rusty screech that seemed to echo through the silent parking lot. I flinched, my heart hammering against my ribs, and scanned the darkness. Nothing moved. I grabbed my laptop bag, slammed the trunk shut, and scurried back to the motel room like a frightened animal returning to its burrow. Back inside. With the chain latched once more, I tore off the grimy coveralls. I felt contaminated by them, by the night's actions. Underneath, my own clothes felt like a fragile link to a person I was no longer. I plugged in my laptop, the glow of the screen a cold modern fire in the shabby room. The VPN connected, a thin digital shield against an empire of flesh and blood monsters. The girl. I had nothing but a mental image of a smiling face in a silver frame. No name, no location. It was an impossible task. I started with the only thing I had. Silas Vane. My previous search had been superficial. Now, I dug deeper into the digital archives, the forgotten corners of the internet, society pages from a decade ago, obituaries, university alum newsletters. I was a linguist, an archaeologist of information, sifting through digital strata. And then I found her. Not in a news article, but in a PDF document buried in the public records of a Swiss boarding school. It was a list of trustees and notable alum donors. Silas Vane was listed as a benefactor, and under a list of scholarship recipients from 15 years ago, there it was. Isabella Vane. Full scholarship. Orphaned. My breath caught. Orphaned. So the photo wasn't just a daughter he was protecting. She was his entire legacy, his only link to a world beyond blood and money. The sentiment he claimed was a luxury was, in fact, his most profound vulnerability, Isabella Vane. The name alone was a weapon. But I needed more. I needed to prove I could find her, I dove back in, cross-referencing the name with the limited information I had. It was like trying to grab smoke. She had no digital footprint, no social media, no public records after that Swiss school. Silas had done his job well. She was a ghost, frustration mounted, a hot, sharp pressure behind my eyes. I had a name, but it was useless without a location. I leaned back, rubbing my temples, my gaze drifting absently around the bleak motel room. It landed on the journal, lying next to my laptop like a sleeping serpent. The account numbers. The emergency fund. A new thought, cold and calculating, slithered into my mind. Money leaves a trail. A ghost account, no matter how well hidden, needs access. Silas was a businessman. He wouldn't keep the keys to his escape hatch solely in his head. There would be a record, a protocol. And my father, the meticulous record keeper, had found it. I picked up the journal again, my fingers tracing the numbers. They were just sequences, but my father's note, the key is the girl. What if it wasn't just a metaphorical key? What if it were a literal one? I opened a new browser tab, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I searched for private banks in Liechtenstein and Switzerland, known for their discretion. I looked up their security protocols for high-value numbered accounts. Many used multi-factor authentication. Something you know, a password. Something you have, a physical token. Or something you are, a biometric key. My blood ran cold. Something you are, a fingerprint. A retinal scan, a voice print. Isabella Vane wasn't just his emotional weakness. She was the literal key to his fortune. He had tied his emergency fund to her identity. To access the money, to disappear, he would need her. It was the ultimate insurance policy, ensuring he could never be separated from her, that she would always be protected because she was intrinsically valuable. And my father had discovered this. This changed everything. It wasn't just that I knew about her. I now understand her function. I knew the deepest, most pragmatic secret of Silas Vane's entire operation. This wasn't just leverage. This was a detonator. But I still didn't know where she was. I looked at the clock on my laptop, 4:17 a.m. The night was bleeding away. I was running out of time. I had to make my move before the sun rose, and Donato's men started their engine for my father's car accident. I had to go back to the beginning. Back to the one place I knew Silas Vane felt secure, back to the lion's den. The plan was insane. It was a suicide mission. I would walk right up to his door and ring the bell. But I wasn't going as a supplicant. I was going as a negotiator. I held the one thing he couldn't afford to lose, the knowledge of his greatest secret. I opened a blank document. I had to craft my message. It couldn't be a plea. It had to be a statement of fact, a demonstration of power. I had to show him that I wasn't a frightened translator anymore. I was a player in his game, and I had just changed the rules. I began to type, my words cold, precise, and utterly without tremor. Mr. Vane, we need to talk. Not about Marseille, about Isabella, and about the account in Zurich that requires her voice to open. The hit on Arthur Vance is cancelled. You will call Donato and cancel it now. I will know if you don't. We will meet in 1 hour. Alone. You know where. I didn't sign it. He would know who it was from. The translator had frozen. The ghost who had walked out of his office and into his deepest secrets. I have attached the scanned image of the journal page with the account numbers, a silent and devastating proof of my claims. I took a deep, shuddering breath. This was the point of no return. Once I sent this, there was no hiding anymore. It was checkmate or death. My finger hovered over the send key. The cursor blinked, a tiny, relentless metronome counting down the last seconds of my old life. I pressed it. The message whooshed away into the digital ether, a spear thrown at a king. I sat back, my entire body trembling. It was done. Now I had to get to the meeting place. I had to face the storm I had just summoned. The silence in the motel room after I sent the email was absolute and heavy, broken only by the frantic thumping of my heart. For a long minute, I just sat there, staring at the screen, at the message sent notification. There was no undo, no takebacks. I had just declared war on a man who ruled an empire from the shadows. My hands were shaking. I balled them into fists, pressing them against the cheap particle board desk until my knuckles turned white. Precision, Ellie. Now was not the time for tremors. Now was the time for steel. I had to move, the meeting place. I'd been deliberately vague. You know where, It was a test. If he were the strategic genius I believed him to be, he would know. The place where this had all begun. Where he had felt safe enough to order a man's death in my presence. His office. The obsidian desk. The floor-to-ceiling windows. The scent of old paper and betrayal. It was the only stage grand enough for this final act. Getting back into that building would be impossible under normal circumstances. But I was counting on his curiosity, his arrogance, and his desperate need to contain this threat. He would let me in. He would want to look me in the eye, to see how the mouse had learned to roar. I changed out of the clothes that smelled of basement dirt and fear, pulling on a simple dark sweater and trousers from my bag. I looked like I was going to a business meeting. In a way, I was. I tucked the journal into the waistband of my trousers, against the small of my back. It was my shield, my only bargaining chip. I left the motel room without a backward glance, the key to room 14 left on the nightstand. I didn't plan on coming back. Either I would walk out of Silas Vane's office with my father's freedom, or I wouldn't walk out at all. The drive back into the heart of the city, as the first hints of dawn painted the sky a bruised purple, felt like a dream. The streets were nearly empty, the world still asleep. I was a lone insomniac moving toward my own execution or my most significant victory. I parked the stolen car in a different lot, several blocks from the Vane Corporation tower. The walk was the longest of my life. The glass and steel skyscraper loomed over me, a monument to his power. The lobby was deserted except for the night security guard, who looked up from his post with mild interest. Before I could even speak, his phone buzzed. He listened for a moment, his eyes flicking to me. Then he nodded. "Penthouse elevator is unlocked for you, Miss Vance," he said, his tone neutral. But his eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. So Silas was expecting me. Of course he was. The elevator ride was a silent, swift ascent. The doors slid open directly into his private foyer. Bruno was there, a mountain of quiet menace, his face an expressionless mask. He didn't speak, just gestured for me to raise my arms. I did. His pat-down was professional, thorough. His hands paused when they felt the hard outline of the journal. He looked at me, a question in his cold eyes. "He'll want to see it," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Bruno nodded once, then stepped aside and opened the door to the office. Silas Vane was standing at the window, his back to me, silhouetted against the burgeoning dawn. The city was waking up below him, a kingdom he believed he controlled. He didn't turn around. "I underestimated you, Miss Vance," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational, a rare and costly mistake. I walked into the center of the room, stopping a few feet from his desk. The air was thick with tension. The hit on my father. "Is it canceled?" He finally turned. In the gray morning light, he looked older, the lines on his face more deeply etched. But his eyes were the same winter storm, sharp and dangerous. "Donato has been temporarily stayed. Pending our discussion. Temporary. It wasn't good enough. Make it permanent." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You walk into my home, you threaten what is mine, and you issue demands? You have courage, I'll grant you that. Or stupidity." "I have information," I corrected him, my voice cold. "I know about Isabella. I am aware of the vocal recognition protocol on the Zurich account, which is your emergency fund. The one that even Donato doesn't know about. The one you can't access without her." The mask of calm cracked. Just for a fraction of a second, a flicker of pure, undiluted fury crossed his features. It was there and gone so fast I might have imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. I had struck a nerve. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I don't know," I said honestly. "And I don't care to know. That's my offer." My father walks away. "You call off your dogs. You leave us both alone. And in return, your secret remains a secret. The journal disappears. No one ever has to know that the voice of his daughter holds together Silas Vane's entire empire." He studied me for a long, silent moment. I could see the calculations going on behind his eyes, the weighing of options, the cold assessment of risk. I was a loose end, but I was a loose end holding a lit match over his gasoline-soaked life. "And if I refuse?" he asked softly. "Then the information in this journal," I said, pulling it from my waistband and holding it up, "goes to every one of your rivals. To Donato, to the authorities in 3 countries. Your empire collapses. And Isabella? Well, without your protection, How long do you think a rich, vulnerable girl would last in the world you've created? It was a brutal, ugly threat. I felt sick saying it. But I was playing for the highest stakes imaginable. Silas took a step toward me. For the first time, I saw not a corporate titan, but a predator. I could have Bruno break your neck right now and take the journal. You could, I agreed, my heart hammering so hard I was sure he could see it. But you won't because you don't know what copies I've made. You don't know who I've told. You don't know if I've set a dead man switch. Killing me now is the riskiest move you could make. This isn't a fight you can win with violence, Mr. Vane. This is a negotiation, and for once I hold all the cards. We stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills, the rising sun casting long, sharp shadows across the room, the translator and the king, the mouse and the lion. He was the first to look away. He walked back to his desk and picked up his phone, his movements stiff with controlled rage. Donato, he said into the receiver, his voice flat. The Vance situation. Stand down. Permanently? I don't care. Find another way to handle the port issue. He's off the table. That is an order. He hung up. The sound of the phone hitting the cradle was as final as a judge's gavel. He looked at me. It's done. A wave of dizzying relief so powerful it nearly buckled my knees washed over me. My father was safe. The journal, Silas said, his hand outstretched. I looked at it. This repository of my father's courage and my own descent into darkness. I had won, but as I looked into Silas Vane's eyes, I saw no defeat. I saw a postponement, a strategic retreat. I had saved my father, but I had made an enemy who would never, ever forget. I placed the journal in his hand. Our fingers did not touch. We're done here, I said, and I turned and walked out of his office, leaving the king in his glass tower, the first and only person to have ever beaten him. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing me in a tomb of my own making. The moment they closed, the steel-plated composure I'd worn in Silas Vane's office shattered. My legs gave way, and I slumped against the wall, a violent, whole-body tremor taking hold. I pressed my forehead to the cool metal, gasping for air as if I'd been drowning. I'd done it. I'd actually done it. I had stared into the abyss and forced it to blink. But he was wrong. But the cost. The cost was a stain on my soul. I had threatened an innocent woman. I had played a game of moral chicken with a monster and won by becoming monstrous myself. The relief was there, a brilliant sunlit peak, but it was overshadowed by the dark valley I had just crawled through. The lobby was still empty. The security guard refused to meet my eyes as I stumbled past him and out into the nascent dawn. The city air, cool and fresh, felt like a lie. The world was continuing as if I hadn't just rewritten my own destiny with threats and blackmail. I walked to the stolen car on autopilot, my mind a numb, buzzing void. I drove. I didn't know where, just away. Away from the tower. Away from the memory of Silas Vane's cold fury. I found myself parked by the lakefront, the water a sheet of gray silk under the morning sky. I killed the engine and finally let the tears come. They were silent, heaving sobs of release, of grief for the person I used to be, of terror for the person I had become. My father was safe. That was the mantra I repeated. He was safe. After what felt like an eternity, the storm passed. I was hollowed out, scraped clean. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes were red-rimmed and haunted, but there was a new hardness in them, a flinty core that hadn't been there before. I couldn't go back to my old life. Silas might have called off the hit, but he would be watching. My apartment, my bank accounts, my digital footprint, it was all compromised. I was free, but I was in a cage of my own making, a gilded cage with invisible bars. I needed to find my father. I needed to see him, to touch him, to know he was real. But I couldn't lead whatever tales Silas would inevitably put on me straight to him. I had to be a ghost one more time. I drove the stolen car to a sketchy part of town and abandoned it, wiping it down with the hem of my sweater. I then walked for miles, taking a zigzag route, hopping on and off buses, my senses screaming for any sign of surveillance. I was a fugitive in my own city. By mid-afternoon, I was sure I was clean. As clean as I could be. I found a payphone, a relic that was now my only safe means of communication. My fingers trembled as I dialed the number for my father's oldest friend, a man named Frank who owned a small, out-of-the-way bar in a neighborhood the Vanes of the world would never frequent. The phone rang twice. "Frank's," a gravelly voice answered. "Frank, it's Alara." My voice was rough from crying and disuse. There was a long pause. "Ellie, Jesus, kid. Where are you? Are you okay? Your dad, he just showed up here an hour ago. He's a mess, but he's okay. He's asking for you." The world tilted. He was okay. He was really okay. The confirmation was a physical blow, draining the last of my strength. I leaned against the payphone booth, my knees weak. "Don't tell him I called," I said, my voice urgent. "Listen to me, Frank, this is important. You have to get him out of the city. Right now, take him to the cabin, up north. You remember the one? It was a place we'd gone fishing when I was a girl, a place with no electricity and no neighbors for miles." "I remember," Frank said, his tone now deadly serious. "What kind of trouble is he in, Ellie?" "The worst kind. But it's handled for now. He needs to disappear, and you can't tell anyone. Not a soul." "Understood." I could hear the unasked questions in his silence, but he was a man who knew when not to ask. "I'll get him moving. What about you?" "I'll find you," I whispered. "When it's safe." I hung up before he could reply, before my resolve could crack. I had to stay away. Seeing him, the emotion would be my undoing. It would make me feel soft and vulnerable, and I couldn't afford to be vulnerable ever again. I was alone, truly alone. I had no home, no job, no identity I could safely use. The money from Silas was tainted, but it was also my only means of survival. I had to disappear, to become someone else entirely. I spent the rest of the day in a branch library, using their computers to research how to forge a new identity. It was a dark, twisted mirror of my usual work. Instead of finding the truth in language, I was learning how to use language to create a lie. I learned about obtaining birth certificates of the deceased, about creating a paper trail, and about flying under the radar. As evening fell, I checked into a different motel, paying cash. This one was slightly less grim than the last, but the despair was the same. I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the room pressing in on me. I had won. I had saved my father. So why did I feel like I had lost everything? The answer was simple. I had lost my innocence, my moral certainty, my future. The woman who had walked into Silas Vane's office 3 months ago was gone. In her place was this new creature, hardened by fear and sharpened by necessity. A survivor. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of the television. The eyes that stared back were not the eyes of Alara Vance, translator. They were the eyes of a stranger, a ghost with a purpose. I had beaten Silas Vane. But the war wasn't over. It had just begun, and I knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, that our paths would cross again. Next time, I will be ready. The name on the forged driver's license was Clara Evans. It felt alien in my mouth, a costume I wasn't sure I could wear. Clara Evans had a birth certificate from a small town in Ohio, a social security number, and a quiet, unremarkable history. She was a ghost, and I was now her haunted house. A week had passed since my standoff with Silas. A week of moving from one cash-only motel to another, of living on cheap food and cheaper coffee, of jumping at every sudden noise. I was a raw nerve, constantly exposed. Sleep was a fractured series of nightmares where I was back in that office. But this time, I was the one giving the orders, my voice cold and flat like Silas's. I'd used a fraction of the tainted cash to secure a studio apartment in a neighborhood that was just this side of gentrification. It was a box with a stained carpet and a window that looked out onto a brick wall, but it was mine. Clara Evans's. I'd bought the basics from a thrift store. A mattress on the floor, a single lamp, and a pot to boil water. It was a far cry from my old life, with its elegant precision of work. This was survival. This was hiding, but I couldn't hide forever. The money wouldn't last, and the silence was driving me mad. I had to work. My skills were my only currency, but I couldn't leverage my name, credentials, or professional networks. They were all poisoned. I spent my days in the public library, just like before, but now I was hunting for a different kind of work. The underbelly of the translation world, The forums where anonymity was prized over reputation, where the jobs were shady and the pay was in cryptocurrency. It was a world of leaked documents, corporate espionage, and whispered secrets. The kind of work I would have once turned down with disdain. Now, it was my only option. I found my first job on a dark web forum, accessed through multiple layers of encryption. A user named Janus needed a series of Russian technical documents translated into English. The subject was advanced polymer chemistry with applications in ballistic armor. It wasn't for a peer-reviewed journal. The pay was generous, the deadline was tight, and no questions were to be asked. I took the job. Clara Evans, translator of ballistic polymers. It felt like a sick joke. The work was a strange sort of solace. It required the same focus and meticulous attention to detail as my old life. For hours at a time, hunched over my laptop in my barren apartment, I could forget that I was a fugitive. I could lose myself in the precise clinical language of tensile strength and molecular bonds. It was a sanctuary of syntax in a world of chaos, but the fear was always there, a low hum in the background. I was constantly looking over my shoulder. Every time a neighbor knocked on a door, every time a car slowed down outside, my heart would leap into my throat. I knew it was paranoid, but paranoia was what kept you alive in my new world. One evening, as I was finishing the final document for Janus, my burner phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize. Only one person had this number. "Frank," I answered, my throat tight. "Yes, it's me," his gruff voice came down the line. "He's safe. He's at the cabin. He's asking for you, Ellie. Every day." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them back ruthlessly. "Is he okay? Really okay?" "He's thin, tired, but he's tough like you. He wants to know what happened." I told him I didn't know. "Good. Keep it that way." The less he knew, the safer he was. The weight of that decision, to keep my own father in the dark, was a stone in my chest. "He said to tell you something," Frank continued, his voice dropping. "He said, the Edelweiss is safe. Does that make any sense to you?" I froze. The Edelweiss. The pressed flower from the journal. It was his way of telling me he knew I had it, that he understood. A wave of emotion so powerful it stole my breath washed over me. He knew I had fought for him. He was telling me he was proud. "It makes sense," I managed to choke out. Tell him the gardener knows. He'll understand." It was a code from my childhood, a game we used to play. It meant the secret was safe with me. "I'll tell him," Frank said. "You be careful, kid." The line went dead. I held the phone to my ear for a long time, listening to the dial tone, a connection to the world I had lost. He was safe, he knew. It had to be enough. I finished the translation for Janus and sent it off into the digital ether. The payment, in Bitcoin, appeared in my anonymous wallet an hour later. It was more money than I would have made in a month at my old corporate rate. The irony was bitter. I looked around my sparse apartment. This was my life now. Clara Evans, translator for the Shadows. A woman with a forged past and a future shrouded in threat. I had saved my father, but I had sacrificed myself on the altar of his safety. I walked to the single window and looked out at the brick wall. Somewhere out there, Silas Vane was still in his glass tower. He thought our business was concluded. He thought I had taken my victory and slunk away into the night. This wasn't an ending. It was an intermission. He had taken my life, my name, my peace. He had forced me to become this hardened, fearful creature. And as I stood there in the silence, a new resolve began to crystallize within me. Cold and sharp as a diamond. I wasn't just going to hide. I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to learn. I was going to get stronger. And I was going to find a way to tear his entire empire down. Brick by bloody brick. This wasn't over. For Silas Vane, it was only the beginning. A year is a long time to live as a ghost. Clara Evans had settled into her skin. The forged identity no longer felt like a costume, but a second layer of flesh. My apartment was still sparse, but it was no longer a temporary refuge. It was a command center. A high-end laptop, paid for with anonymous crypto, sat on a cheap desk. The walls were bare, but my digital reach had grown long and intricate. The work for Janus had been the beginning. My reputation in the shadowy world of illicit translation grew. I was known as the scribe. Accurate, discreet, and utterly without curiosity. I translated arms manifests, encrypted messages between rival syndicates, and financial records that would have made the SEC weep. With each job, I learned, I absorbed the structures, the protocols, the weaknesses of the world Silas Vane ruled. I was a scholar of my own enemy's kingdom. The fear was still there, a constant low-grade hum, but it had been joined by something else, a cold, focused purpose. I wasn't just hiding. I was building an arsenal of knowledge. My father was safe, living a quiet, isolated life under Frank's watchful eye. Our communication was sparse. A handful of coded messages passed through layers of cutouts. It was agony, but it was necessary. He was my one vulnerability, the only piece of my old heart I had left, and I would die before I let Silas use him against me again. Tonight, I was working on a particularly complex job, a series of intercepted communications between a Bratva captain in Brighton Beach and a new ambitious cartel pushing into the Midwest. The language was brutal, the threats graphic. I translated it with clinical detachment, my fingers flying across the keyboard. As I worked, a separate window on my screen was dedicated to a personal project, a digital map of Silas Vane's empire. I was piecing it together, thread by thread, from the thousands of fragments of data I'd translated over the months. The legitimate businesses, the shell corporations, the shipping routes, the names of his captains. I was reverse engineering his entire operation from the outside in. A soft chime from my encrypted messaging app broke my concentration. It was from a source I'd cultivated for weeks, a mid-level money launderer with a gambling problem and loose lips. His alias was Croupier. Croupier, something big is moving. Vane is nervous. My pulse quickened. I typed back, my words deliberate. The scribe. Define big. Croupier. A deal. The biggest, with the Volkovs, Russian. But there's a problem, a snag. Vane's personal security around the girl has tripled. He's spooked. The girl. Isabella. My breath hitched. This was it. A vulnerability. When a man like Silas got nervous, he made mistakes. And a mistake was an opening. The scribe. What kind of snag? Croupier. Don't know. Whispers only. Something about the deal being too sweet. A trap, but Vane needs it. He's overextended due to cash flow problems. I leaned back, my mind racing. Silas was vulnerable, financially overextended, and making a desperate high-stakes play with the notoriously treacherous Volkov syndicate. And his paranoia about Isabella was at an all-time high. This was the perfect storm, but I couldn't act yet. I needed more. I needed proof. Something concrete I could use not just to threaten, but to dismantle. An idea began to form, audacious and terrifying. The Volkovs. I had just translated their communications. I knew their protocols, their encryption patterns. What if I didn't just watch the storm? What if I steered it? It would be the riskiest thing I had ever done. I would be playing with forces that could obliterate me without a second thought. But it was the only way to hit Silas where he lived, to burn his empire to the ground from the inside. For the next 48 hours, I didn't sleep at all. I lived on coffee and adrenaline, my world narrowing to the glow of my laptop screen. I cross-referenced everything I had on the Vane Volkov deal. I leveraged my access to their communications to gain a comprehensive understanding of the negotiation, and then I began to write. I composed an email that perfectly mimicked the tone and encryption signature of Volkov's lead negotiator. I didn't send it to Silas. I sent it to Donato. The message was brief, brutal, and designed to ignite a particular kind of paranoia. The terms are agreed, but we no longer trust Vane's control. The girl is the collateral. She comes to us until the first shipment is complete. If you refuse, the deal is dead, and we will consider your territory open for acquisition. I sent the message into the digital void, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was a lit match thrown into a room full of gasoline. The reaction was faster than I anticipated. Within hours, my network of digital whispers began to scream. Croupier messaged, panicked. Croupier, it's chaos. Donato is furious. He thinks Vane is cutting a side deal, offering the girl as a personal guarantee behind his back. They're at each other's throats. A savage, grim satisfaction bloomed in my chest. I had done it. I had turned them against each other. The snake was eating its own tail, but I wasn't done. I had one more move to make. I accessed a backdoor I'd found in the Vane Corporation's personnel server, a vulnerability I'd discovered while translating their internal IT protocols months ago. I created a single ghost entry in their security logs. It was a log of a high priority, encrypted video call, the listed participants, Silas Vane and Arthur Vance. The timestamp was for yesterday, and the duration was 12 minutes. It was a lie. A beautiful, devastating lie. For Silas, it would be proof that his supposedly silenced liability was not only alive, but actively communicating with his greatest enemy. For Donato, if he saw it, it would be the final confirmation of Silas's betrayal. I sat back, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from the raw, terrifying power I had just wielded. I had started as a victim, then a survivor. Now I was a predator. I looked at the map of Silas's empire on my screen. The first cracks were beginning to show. I had started the fire. Now, I just had to watch it burn. The fire caught and burned faster and hotter than I could have ever imagined. The digital whispers from the croupier turned into a frantic, continuous scream over the next 24 hours. The fragile alliance between Silas Vane and Donato, built on decades of shared power and paranoia, was shattered with the force of a bomb blast. My forged security log was the spark that lit the fuse. Donato, already enraged by the Volkov demand regarding Isabella, saw the record of the call between Silas and my father as ultimate proof of betrayal. He saw it not as a business dispute, but as a personal, unforgivable act of treachery. The violence wasn't contained to boardrooms or back alleys. It erupted in the open. A Vane Corporation shipping warehouse on the docks went up in flames, the fire lighting the night sky for miles. 2 of Donato's most trusted captains were found in the trunk of a car, a message carved into their flesh. The city was at war, and I was the ghost in the machine who had pulled the trigger. I watched it all from my sterile apartment. My screen's a mosaic of news reports, police scanner traffic, and panicked messages from the underworld forums. I felt no triumph, only a cold, clinical detachment. I had set these events in motion. I was the author of this chaos. Then the message came. Not from Croupier, not from any of my shadowy contacts. It was from Silas Vane. It arrived in the encrypted dead drop box I used for my highest-risk clients. The message was brief, consisting of just 3 words. I know. Come. There was no threat, no demand, just a simple, terrifying statement of fact. He knew. He had pieced it together. The fabricated Volkov message, the forged security log. He knew it was me. My blood ran cold, but my hands were steady. This was the moment I had been preparing for. The moment the mouse had to face the lion, not from a place of desperate blackmail, but from a position of calculated strength. I didn't hesitate. I typed my reply, my fingers calm on the keys. Where? The answer came back instantly. An address, not his office. A private airfield on the outskirts of the city, neutral ground, or a trap. It didn't matter. I had to go. This was the end game. I dressed with deliberate care, choosing dark, practical clothing. I didn't bother with a weapon. Against Silas Vane and whatever men he had with him, a gun would be useless. My only defense was the truth and the chaos I had unleashed. I drove to the airfield in the dead of night, the road strangely empty. The address led to a hangar at the far end of the tarmac, isolated and dark. A single light burned inside. I pushed the heavy hangar door open and stepped into the vast, echoing space. The air smelled of jet fuel and dust, and there, in the center of the empty concrete floor, stood Silas Vane. He was alone. No Bruno, no Lorenzo, no guards. He stood under the single hanging work light, his hands in the pockets of his overcoat. He looked older, wearier, the events of the past days etched into his face. But his eyes, those storm-gray eyes, were as sharp and dangerous as ever. "You look well, Ilara," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Clara Evans suits you." "So you found me," I said, stopping a dozen feet from him. The distance felt like a mile. It was only a matter of time. "You've been busy. You've cost me a great deal. In revenue, in men, in trust. You tried to have my father killed," I replied, my voice flat. "I'd say we're even." A faint, bitter smile touched his lips. "Even. You've started a war that will consume this city. You've pitted me against Donato, against the Volkovs. You've destroyed in a week what it took me 30 years to build. Then you should have chosen your enemies more carefully." He took a step forward. I held my ground. "This ends tonight," he said. "One way or another. You will call off your dogs. You will retract your forgeries. You will disappear and you will never surface again, or what?" I challenged, my heart hammering. "You'll kill me? You could have done that already. You didn't bring me here to kill me. You brought me here because you have no other choice. The war I started, only I can stop it." He was silent for a long moment, studying me. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the cold assessment of a man who had run out of good options. "What do you want?" he asked, and for the first time, I heard a flicker of something other than absolute control in his voice. Exhaustion, desperation. "I want you to walk away," I said. "I want you to dissolve the Vane Corporation. Please take your daughter and your ghost account, and you disappear. Leave this city, leave this life, or I will burn the rest of it to the ground." "You would still threaten her?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "I'm not threatening her. I'm giving you a choice, a way out, a life for your daughter, away from all this, or a war that will eventually find her, no matter how well you think you've hidden her. The choice is yours." The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. I could see the war raging within him, the king unwilling to abdicate his throne, the father desperate to protect his child. "You have no idea what you're asking," he whispered. "I know exactly what I'm asking," I said. "I'm asking you to do the one thing you've never done in your entire life. Lose." He looked away, his gaze drifting toward the dark mouth of the hangar, toward the freedom of the night sky. I had thrown his own words back at him. Sentiment is a luxury, but I had learned that it wasn't a luxury. It was a weapon, and I had just aimed it at his heart. When he looked back at me, the storm in his eyes had quieted and not into peace, but into a bleak, resigned acceptance. "The hangar at Zurich Airport," he said, his voice hollow. "A private Gulfstream. It will be ready in 6 hours. Isabella and I will be on it." A wave of disbelief washed over me. I had won and truly won, and Donato? The Volkovs? I asked. "Leave them to me," he said, a flicker of the old predator returning to his eyes. "A final piece of business. They will be too busy with each other to notice I'm gone." He turned and began to walk away, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He stopped at the hangar door and looked back at me one last time. "You were right, you know," he said. "You held all the cards." And then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I stood alone in the hangar, the silence pressing in on me. It was over. I had won. I had toppled a king. I walked out into the cool night air, the stars sharp and clear above me. The war wasn't over, but my part in it was. Silas Vane was leaving. My father was safe. I was free. But as I drove away from the airfield, I knew I wasn't the same woman who had fled into the night a year ago. I was harder, sharper, forever marked by the darkness I had faced and wielded. I had my life back, but the cost was a piece of my soul. I was free, but I would never be innocent again. The first light of dawn was bleeding into the sky as I pulled up to the remote cabin. It was nestled deep in the pine forests, a place of weathered wood and silence, with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. I killed the engine and just sat for a moment, watching the smoke curl from the chimney, a simple, human sign of life that felt more precious than anything. The door opened before I could even get out. Frank stood there, his grizzled face breaking into a rare, broad smile. He nodded once, a world of understanding passing between us. Then he stepped aside, and then he was there. My father. He stood in the doorway, thinner, his hair more gray, his face etched with lines of stress and time. But his eyes, the same clear, intelligent eyes I had inherited, were alive and full of a light I thought I'd extinguished forever. "Ellie," he breathed, his voice cracking on the single syllable. I was out of the car and across the clearing in a heartbeat. I threw my arms around him, burying my face in the rough wool of his sweater. He felt frail, but his arms around me were strong, holding me as if I were the most fragile, precious thing in the world. We stood there for a long time, not speaking, just holding on, the silence saying everything that words never could. Finally he pulled back, his hands cupping my face. He looked at me, really looked, and I saw the moment he recognized the changes, the new hardness in my gaze, the shadows that hadn't been there before. He didn't flinch. He just nodded, a deep, profound sadness and pride mingling in his expression. "You found the Edelweiss," he said softly. "I found it," I whispered. "The gardener is gone." He understood. Silas was gone. He pulled me into another fierce hug. My brave, brave girl. We spent the day by the fire, talking in fragments. I didn't tell him everything. I couldn't. The darkness of what I'd done, the threats, the forgeries, the cold manipulation, those were my burdens to carry. I told him I'd uncovered Silas's crimes and used the information to force him out. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. He told me about his captivity, the fear, the not knowing, and then the sudden, inexplicable release. Frank showing up, the frantic drive north, the agonizing wait for any word from me. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice firm. I never doubted it for a second. As evening fell, Frank went out to check the perimeter, a habit he'd developed during our exile. My father and I sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars emerge. "What will you do now, Ellie?" he asked quietly. I looked out at the dark, solid shapes of the trees. I had spent a year being Clara Evans, a creature of shadows and vengeance. I didn't know who I was anymore. "I don't know," I admitted, the words feeling like a confession. "I can't go back to my old life." The thought of sitting in a sterile conference room, translating corporate contracts, felt like a distant, childish dream. "You don't have to," he said, his hand finding mine. "You get to choose who you are now. You've earned that." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the peace of the forest a balm on my ragged soul. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his tone shifting. "Something I never could before, about why I started digging into Vane's business in the first place." I turned to look at him. This was the missing piece. "It wasn't just about the corruption," he said, his gaze distant. "It was about your mother," my breath caught. "Mom, her illness, the medical bills that bankrupted us. It wasn't just bad luck, Ellie." He took a shaky breath. "The hospital, the one that charged us a fortune for the experimental treatments. It was owned by a shell corporation, one of Vane's. I found out later that they were inflating costs and siphoning money. They profited from our despair, from her death. A cold, pure fury, cleaner than any I had felt before, swept through me. It wasn't just business. It was personal. Silas Vane hadn't just threatened my father. His world had indirectly, callously, contributed to my mother's suffering. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and my resolve, which had wavered in the face of peace, solidified into something unbreakable. I stood up, the blanket falling from my shoulders. The night air was cold on my skin. "What is it?" my father asked, concern in his voice. "I know what I'm going to do," I said, my voice clear and steady in the darkness. I wasn't Alara Vance, the translator. I wasn't Clara Evans, the ghost. The world Silas Vane had built was still out there, wounded and leaderless, yet it remained a cancer. Donato, the Volkovs, and all the other predators were already moving in to carve up the territory. The violence would continue. The corruption would fester. I had torn down the king, but the kingdom remained, and I knew it better than anyone alive. I looked at my father, at the love and worry in his eyes. "I'm not going back to my old life," I said. "I'm going to finish what you started."